It's nasty weather out there. It's fucking raining outside my damn apartment. But so what better things to do than to just sit at home and while it's raining outside and just film videos all day. Um, Now the GOP is no longer a pro-business party, and I never saw them as one as that. Um, Climate change is making the world unsafe for capitalism in the face of the frequent and devastating shocks that have been wrought by unabated warming. The fundamental conditions supporting the financial system could prove impossible to sustain. Finance will struggle to perform its risk management function if entire coastal regions become uninsurable. Banks won't supply Americans breadbasket um, much credit if droughts routinely desiccate its crops. Already, private investors are failing to price assets in a manner consistent with ecological reality. Only a combination of carbon taxes that internalize dirty energy's true social cost and speed up the development of renewables can mitigate the physical and financial risks that lie ahead of us. Therefore, the U.S. government must aggressively intervene in energy markets while ensuring that the burden of a green transition does not fall on what they call low to moderate income households or historically marginalized communities post haste. This analyst does not come courtesy of Greenpeace, of the Sunrise Movement, or some eggheads at the United Nations. Rather, it is a rough summary of a report commissioned by the Fat Ass 45 appointed Commodity Futures Trading Commission, also known as CFTC, and it's written by analysts from Morgan Stanley, S&P Global, Vanguard, BP, ConocoPhillips, and Cargill. In collaboration with academics and environmentalists, some of those firms issued statements stipulating that they don't necessarily endorse the reports that every particular, only its broad strokes. Released on Wednesday morning, the report echoes the conventional wisdom among financial observers in the less climate science averse corners of Western capitalism. 5 years ago, again, Mark Carney, who was then governor of the Bank of England, had warned that the planet's warming system presented three systemic risks to the global financial system, that catastrophic losses would tank the heavily financialized insurance industry and take financial markets down with it. That liability lawsuits from victims of climate change could suddenly erase the value of dirty energy firms, and that failure to orchestrate a steady transition to renewables would result in a sudden and belated abandonment of its trillions of dollars worth of fossil fuel assets. Assuming that no spectacular breakthrough in carbon capture, um, if we are to stabilize temperatures below catastrophic levels, the vast majority of the world's known fossil fuel reserves will have to stay in the ground. Leaving that energy untapped will mean as much as a $28 trillion in lost revenue for oil, gas, and coal companies over the next 20 years. Um, and that matters for the financial system because investors already own bonds and shares connected to those assets. If financial markets have time to adjust, even such huge losses could be absorbed. But if the changes strike lenders and investors suddenly and unexpectedly, they risk triggering a financial heart attack, a crippling blow to bank balance sheets that radiates, as well as we saw in 2008, to the entire economy. In the subprime mortgage sector, which was worth around about $1 trillion, losses ran to a few hundred billion dollars, and the carbon bubble is far larger. On Wednesday, the Republican CFTC chairman Heath Talbert had discounted some of his own commission's ideologically inconvenient findings by noting in an interview with the New York Times that the subcommittee's report acknowledges that transition risks of a green economy could be just as disruptive to our financial system as the possible physical manifestations of climate change, and that moving too fast too soon could be just as disorderly as doing too little too late. But this is a misleading on the report. Transitioning too fast does present a financial risk, but bringing the value of all untapped fossil fuel assets down to zero tomorrow would sow financial chaos. But there is no such thing as transitioning too soon. As the CFTC's own graphic illustrates, the sooner America imposes a carbon tax and other reforms aimed at moving capital away from oil and toward renewables, the more gradual and orderly the energy transition will be. Um, Tarbert, um, Tarbert's error is blatant but understandable. After all, his commission's findings can only be reconciled with his with his fat ass's agenda if they are willfully misinterpreted. Fat ass 45 has done virtually everything in its power to increase carbon emissions and further externalize the social cost of dirty energy. In interviews with the Times, the authors of the CFTC's report acknowledged that if Fat Ass 45 is re-elected, his administration is all but certain to ignore the report and its recommendations, which is to say financial analysts from some of the world's most powerful corporations apparently see the re-election of a Republican fat ass as a threat to long-term stability of global capitalism. Meanwhile, Wall Street's largest banks reassured their clients this week that congressional Republicans will eventually acquiesce to another hefty stimulus package, as opposed to the skinny one that the party currently backs, with Morgan Stanley projecting a $1.5 trillion to $2 trillion package by the month's end. At present, Moscow, Mitch, and company have refused to meet Nancy Pelosi's caucus halfway on relief funding. This is in part because Republicans oppose significant fiscal aid for states and cities, a policy that enjoys the support of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Moody's Analytics, which is which has argued that every state needs additional federal aid and that the economic impacts of states not receiving it quickly are exceedingly high. These developments testify to an underappreciated fact about contemporary American politics. Contrary to popular conception, the GOP does not govern in the interest of U.S. business, or at least not in the long-term interest of U.S. business as a whole. To be sure, Fat Ass 45 has done a great deal to benefit but basically he's benefited off the corporate America's incumbent executives, especially those looking to maximize their own wealth in the run-up to retirement. Through his regressive tax cuts and deregulatory measures, the fat ass has saved major U.S. firms and their shareholders a bundle. The nation's six largest banks alone have pocketed $32 billion as a consensus of Fat Ass 45's policies, and for America's most socially irresponsible enterprises, this administration has been a true godsend. Since taking over, the Fat Ass 45 White House has, among other things, expanded the liberty of coal companies to dump mining waste in streams, pushed to preserve the rights of retirement advisors to gamble with their clients' money, freed employers from the burden of logging all workplace injuries, and ended discrimination with serial labor law violators in the bidding process for government contracts. But the Republican Party is too corrupted by rentier and extractive industries, and too besotted with conservative economic orthodoxy to advance the long-term best interests of American capital. The reality has made itself conspicuous at various points over the past 2 decades. During the 2008 crisis, then-President George W. Bush's efforts to stabilize the U.S. financial system encountered sustained opposition from his party's House caucus, relying on strong Democratic support to make it into law. Over the ensuing years, the Tea Party's debt ceiling demagoguery repeatedly threatened to force the country into a needless debt default. Under Fat Ass 45's leadership, or failed leadership anyway. Meanwhile, the GOP has dismantled much of the pandemic management infrastructure that its Democratic predecessor had built up in response to the 2014 Ebola outbreak. Once COVID-19 arrived, the fat ass proceeded to misleadingly downplay the threat of the virus, discouraged its supporters from complying with the recommended measures for containing its spread. They refused to coordinate a comprehensive federal response, opting instead to let blue states bid against each other for limited supplies. They convened potential super spreader events in viral hotspots, publicly admitted that he hoped to suppress testing so as to make case counts look more favorable than they actually were, and advised Americans that injecting disinfectant into the lungs might cure the COVID, and blocked fiscal aid to states and cities amid a broader effort to coerce them into reopening their economies before the virus was contained. It is impossible to say precisely how many of the 190,000 U.S. COVID deaths, or how much of the pandemic estimated that the $8 trillion domestic economic toll would have been averted were it not for the were it not for the Fat Ass 45's GOP exceptionally irresponsible management of public health. But we do know this: despite the fact that America's population is younger than the European Union, and thus at a lesser collective risk to COVID-19, our per capita death rate is more than twice as high. If our COVID death to population ratio was the same as the East European Union's, 106,000 fewer Americans would have perished from that disease. Thus, it is not necessarily in the immediate interest of U.S. business with large of the U.S. business writ large to have a simplistic con man in charge of the federal government, no matter how much he helps individual firms loot the public purpose or skirt regulatory compliance. To the contrary, it is at least conceivable that, had the U.S. presidency had not been held by an ideological movement contemptuous of the very concept of public health in 2020, American businesses would have been trillions of dollars more profitable in the coming decades than they are now poised to be. Um, Contra ruling class reactionaries, self-flattering dogmas, private enterprises, and always has been reliant on the competent statecraft. Conservatives recognize capital's reliance on big government in the realm of military defense, but in the anthropocene potence or posing or whatever. Anyway, the emergent diseases and climate change pose at least as large a threat to capital accumulation as any hostile foreign power. Meanwhile, in a globalized economy beset by chronic shortfalls of demand and periodic financial shocks, the GOP's resilient skepticism about economic stimulus renders the party an uncertain friend to corporate America in its times of need. Granted, the party has largely fulfilled its duty to reflate asset prices and shore up credit markets this year, but the strength of the recovery, such as it is at least partly attributable to policies that originated with Democrats, and which the GOP accepted only grudgingly in March and has since refused to renew, there's every reason to think that American businesses, especially the small ones, would be better off if Pelosi's caucus could set fiscal policy by fiat. None of this is to suggest that the Democratic Party reliably advances the enlightened interest of American business. In the recent past, Democratic administrations have been led astray by many of the same stale premises that presently shape the GOP orthodoxy. Bill Clinton's deregulation of finance and budget balancing laid the groundwork for a financial crisis that the U.S. economy never fully recovered from. Barack Obama's fear of deficits, or at least deficit politics, led his party to pursue a grossly inadequate fiscal response to the Great Recession. Separately, Democrats are more accountable to labor, environmentalists, and other economic stakeholders whose interests are in some tension with the imperative of profit maximization, even on a long-term horizon. Nevertheless, if one accepts the reality of climate science and the analysts of Fat Ass 45's own CFTC, it is clear that the Democratic Party is the most capable steward of American capitalism on offer. The GOP may be a more indulgent guardian. It may spoil its favorite industries rotten with gifts and permissiveness, but spare the state capacity, and you will spoil the corporate sector. Fat Ass 45 may not give the fossil fuel companies a hard time for despoiling the planet, but someday they're going to learn that out in the real world, such misbehavior has very big consequences. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, Random Mike, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out, and thanks for listening.